Hey pals, welcome back to a new video. Today we're going to be discussing design, particularly a case study in how I designed the map for Insignia. And this is going to be kind of a bit of a defensive video, starting with this concept of scope creep. I hear it get thrown around a lot, and when you've been working on a game as long as I have, the idea that, oh, you're just adding things for the sake of it gets thrown around a lot. And I think when devs who are like me, a bit of a perfectionist, a bit imposter syndrome, you might find yourself questioning why you might add a feature to your game or whether it deserves to be in the game. And I feel quite confident that I've kind of solved this problem, and I want to walk you through kind of how I got there. So the map in Insignia is a feature that I never really intended to be a big deal, right? It first started as this thing that I just drew as a mock-up. It's like a sketch of the world map. And I kind of thought that maybe I would have the ability to teleport between regions of the game at some point. In the 5th chapter of the game, the final chapter, I kind of have this like Final Fantasy VII Disc 3 plan where you can go back to any of the places and they've changed somewhat since you've been there. So the first part of the game, you're limited in which zones you can go to, and then maybe later you would be able to teleport. For like 8 years, this is where this was. Okay, and I had no plans to work on this year either. I kind of thought maybe, again, towards the back of the development, it might come in handy. But other than that, it wasn't really on my radar. Something happened, however, when I was building a pitch deck for GDC earlier this year, where I was trying to explain the game's features, and one of the features was the world. I was trying to explain how expansive and full the world is. And I didn't really have a slide where I could very appropriately express that. And as a story, like as a game that's an adventure title, world building is a big part of that. And the idea that you can explore is one of the core kind of vision pieces of the game. It's one of what I call the pillars of the game, is exploration. And this map kind of is an abstraction of what I use in the game as a way of managing the world. This is Scene Graph. I've made videos about it. It's basically just all of the levels in my Unity project set up in such a way that I can drag links between the nodes, and each node is a level. There's an automated screenshot of a level that gets taken, and I can very easily just double click on one to open up that scene in the editor. And it started just as a management tool, right? It was just like, oh, hey, I want to be able to see the game that I'm making. How do I do that? This is very organic, this process. And it's what I would like to call creative discovery. If you're an artist, if you're a musician, this idea of jamming something out or letting the art piece speak to you, letting the thing shape itself. Michelangelo talked about the idea of like discovering the sculpture inside of the granite. All of these things relate to exploring design space. So I was kind of converging on that from an editor side and also from a presentation side. I wanted to share information about the game, and I wanted to be able to see the game. So here's the map that I kind of drew in a slide in the pitch deck. So the next beat that took place was basically this process of playtesting the game. I had taken the game through the first chapter of production using the grant funding that we received last year. And in order to basically get the last 20%, you have to deliver something. So I wanted to play test the game ahead of the delivery earlier this year. And we used what I call the Insignia alpha test program, which is a version of the game that gets pushed to itch.io that players can test, and at the end they fill out a feedback form. The feedback from that form revealed something that I had been feeling when working on the game, but didn't really have a great way of articulating, or wasn't really sure if I was just sort of seeing things or not. And the thing that was revealed was that the pacing of the game felt not great. The game has lots of content at this point. Like somehow we realized that the like half an hour that chapter 1 had started as in 2020 was now like 2.5 hours of content if you wanted to 100% it. But that content didn't feel like it had a lot of drive to it. And when interpreting player feedback, which is the same as user feedback when you're doing UX design, you always have to look through it from a lens of interpreting rather than just taking it on board directly. You can't just, players aren't designers, so they don't know why they're feeling what they're feeling. They just know that they're feeling it. And so the common sentiment was this idea of, hey, I'm playing through the story. The story is telling me about places that I'm going to go to. But I don't know how long it's supposed to take me to get to those places, and I don't know how far I am from them. So until I get to the next plot beat, I don't actually know what I'm doing or if I'm doing the right thing. I don't know if I'm on the right path. And I wasn't sure at first whether this was something that I needed to solve with storytelling or with brevity, like just being more concise with the game, like cut stuff out to make it happen sooner, right? Those plot beats that the player is expecting. But that didn't quite seem right to me because there are lots of games that I've played that have very little direction, but that you sort of have fun playing in for hours and hours and hours. Minecraft being one of them, right? Games that have good exploration, or even any Metroidvania that I've played. Games that have these exploration elements don't typically require so much hand-holding. So in the interest of pacing, one of the things that I had noticed that I had done earlier in the chapter, in the effort of trying to give the player some heads up about where they're supposed to go, was this notion of loading into a level and showing the player where they're going to go at the end of the level from the start. So this scene loads up, I show you the tower that you're going to head to, and then I just let you go and run to it at your own leisure. And scenes like this seem to work quite well. So it was clearly, in my estimation, more of a question of wayfinding than a question of pacing from a story perspective. It's not that the story was necessarily too fast or too slow, but that the player didn't have permission to feel comfortable exploring. How long until this is going to happen? How much exploring should I be doing? Am I heading in the right direction? Lots of questions that didn't have answers. And so that still created a negative kind of tension, but not necessarily tension to do with the story being told in a poorly paced way, just a lack of anticipation. So this put me down the path of, okay, maybe it's time to add a map into the game. And I want to be clear that this little revelation, it's something that if you were working on a game where you were thinking about it as a Metroidvania, let's say you say, I'm making a Metroidvania. One of the first things you would do is put a map in that game. And it seems kind of obvious if you know that you're modeling a game based on some other genre, it seems obvious to just add the features of that genre. But I never started Insignia as a Metroidvania. I never even started it thinking about it as a game that needed a map or was particularly heavy on exploration. But over the years, it's become clear that the game kind of, it wanted to be a game that had more exploration in it. As I added puzzle elements, having some elements be off the beaten path became important. As I added the idea of builds and having equipment and accessories in the game, having those be things that you find, was just something that, it meant exploration became a bigger part of the game. I think what I want to say here is that it's not always obvious that you need a feature. Part of the beauty of creative discovery is not knowing what the game needs to be, right? If you're open to the game telling you what it needs to be, then you can't start with a brief that says it needs to have feature A, B, C, D. The only way you can do that is if you're modeling after some other game. So I knew I was going to make a map and I wanted to do some research, which has now informed this video. You can see here I've created a big spectrum of maps, and I was doing some analysis, competitive analysis about, okay, when are maps used? What are the different kinds of maps and what are the contexts based on the genre where certain maps get used more than others? I like to think about genre here as a space rather than specific names. So it's not just about Metroidvania versus action adventure versus platformer. It's more like if your game is a bit more Vania-y or a bit more roguelike-y, what are the odds that you're going to need a map with these kinds of features, right? We're just keeping it soupy and like a space here. So this idea of what does a map need to be was where I started, right? What do maps do? And particularly, how do they meet the needs that my players have? Right, that's the whole point. I'm adding this because feedback told me that I needed something to fill this hole. And I was identifying that maps fill that hole. So maps create object permanence where the player's sense of direction or memory would otherwise fail them, right? In a 2D game, especially when you leave the screen, right, you go somewhere else, you can't see the thing you just left, right? You can't spin the camera around and look behind you and say, oh yeah, 100 feet back that way, there's that tower I just left. If it's off screen on 2D games, it's gone. So a map basically gives you the ability to see multiple places at once that you can't be in at the same time, which is good because it allows the player to plan ahead or fill in gaps. Sometimes it can create anticipation by revealing locations of places you haven't been yet. It can also allow the player to mark the map sometimes. So the idea of like planning your play around the space creates anticipation. It lets the player create stories themselves, right? These kind of like emergent or meta stories of like, I wonder what's over there. I'm going to go do that, right? That creates good traction for a player. It also takes the strain off of the player's suspense built up by navigating a large sprawling world. So if the game is really, really big and you don't have a map, you're kind of relying on your memory in order to do things. And that as that memory gets strained, it can sometimes put tension on the player that's uneasy, right? Like horror games would be a good example of a genre where you might not want to map on purpose. You might specifically want the player to feel anxious as they explore because you don't want them to know where they're going. So this is the product of a bunch of competitive research that I did, basically comparing lots of different games and their maps once I decided I needed a map. And I call it the Can You Get Lost map. The axis across the top is basically an axis of Euclidean space. So whether the games have Euclidean space or not. Euclidean space is the concept of a space, a world that is consistent in its geometry, right? So it's a sphere or it's a grid. In a game like Minecraft, the world is Euclidean, although the nether would be a non-Euclidean slice of the world. So being able to move faster in the nether and then come back further away than you walked, that's non-Euclidean. And most games, especially prior to like open world games, most games are non-Euclidean. It's very convenient to design a level in, say, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. That game would be built out of a bunch of rooms, essentially, or even Mario 64, right? All of those places that you go are not in physical space relative to each other. There is an overworld map, like Hyrule Field, and it has a bunch of doors. And the doors basically just like unload Hyrule Field and load you into a door somewhere else in a different level. So the idea of drawing a map to represent that space, like how would you draw a map of Mario 64? You kind of can't really, because the places don't have any relationship to each other other than the networks. There are some games where the maps matter in terms of wayfinding, and there's some where they don't. Let's start on the non-Euclidean side, where the map is really about form and not so much about function. Okay, so here I've got a bunch of examples of games where there is a world map, but the world map is representing a space that's level-based. Okay, in a platformer like Super Mario Brothers or Super Mario World, you have basically like a linear space that you are just trekking through. Celeste is another example. And the map is really just a screen that you go to between levels. It's mostly just a way of letting you know how many levels there are and kind of like giving you some kind of flavor about what the next level is going to be about. It's also kind of important to appreciate the fact that these levels, as they appear on the map, are points, okay? Because you enter the level and you exit the level from the same place. Then we have maps that I would consider kind of like in the murky middle. This is what I would say is typical for adventure games, games where the player progress is not directly tied to where you are on the map, meaning it might be important for you to go somewhere else that you've been before, or to head east and then later head west on a different part of the map. So traversing the map is something that you do on foot typically. And when you bring up the map after running around for a bit, you might be somewhere else relative to where you were last time. So it's kind of interesting looking at something like Ocarina of Time, how they represent the world, because these levels are, I would say, like partially geometrically related to what the levels are. Like Lake Hylia here, like it looks like what that level looks like in the game. say the distance here between that and like the Gerudo Valley, I'm not sure that's like an exact distance. It kind of feels like we've placed some abstract versions of the levels around just to give the player some sense of where they are. It's also really important to recognize that a game like Ocarina of Time has a second kind of map, right? A mini map. And the mini map typically is a perfect representation of what the level actually looks like. So like here, we're looking at a screenshot. This is Hyrule Field, right? And when you move around it, there's like a little cursor that like represents where Link is facing and how he's moving, that actually represents the literal, geometry of the map. Moving on to like another Zelda. So this is Twilight Princess's map. This map is, as far as I understand, pretty much Euclidean, right? So it's almost like all of the mini maps chained together, right, in one map. And it's not perfect, but at any one time, you can get a pretty good sense of where you are. And the idea is that, yes, like if I'm standing, here and I want to go all the way to here, I can figure out how to do that by thinking about the places that I would need to go on the way there. I can play Google Maps in my head and get from A to B. You can't really do that in a game that doesn't have at least some kind of continuous geometry, even if it's not Euclidean. So Fez is a game just like Zelda, where there's just like a bunch of levels, right, that are created in isolated scenes, but there are doors between those levels that are at least consistent, right? Like the doors are connected in what you would describe as a graph, an undirected graph, so that you can go to and from nodes in the graph and get from A to B reliably. If you look at the map, although it's super abstract, right, and you can rotate this thing in 360 degrees, it's actually really hard to use the map. This is probably the best kind of map that could have been made for this game, right? Because it's literally just a bunch of doors and connections. As a data structure, what is the appropriate way of describing this like multi-dimensional space? Then we have our Metroidvania maps, and these are usually quite strictly Euclidean. In fact, you're expected to bring up the map in order to figure out how to get from A to B. One of the chief things about this process that makes a game feel the way that it does, like what makes Vania games feel like Vania games, is the idea to look at an empty spot on the map and say, I think there might be something there because there's an empty space. In a non-Euclidean game, you can't say that. You don't know what is and what isn't space. But in a game like Castlevania, if you see a door or even Animal Well, right, if you see part of this map that's blacked out, you can almost guarantee that there's going to be something there. And you can visually look at the map and trace the walls and say, oh, okay, there's no breaks in this wall, so I probably can't get here in the game. But if there is a space that's all blacked out, but you can see there's the outline of a room, you can say, okay, I'm going to go there because I know that there's something there that I haven't seen. That's very valuable. It changes the way that the player perceives the game because it changes the contract of what is content and what isn't, right? What means something and what doesn't. You would never make that kind of inference if you're looking at Celeste. You would never say, oh, what's on the other side of this mountain? I wonder what it is. Or what's underneath this bridge? Because you can't explore the mountain. You can't explore the bridge. You can't go to those places organically on foot. Then we have our modern day open world maps, which are, yes, Euclidean. In fact, the game's maps are usually a projection of the world, like a big, geometry scan. And they're full of nodes and full of, kind of telling you where to go based on the fact that the game has quests, and those quests have quest NPCs that give you them, or they have, in this case, shrines you can teleport between. And I think this is kind of like the final iteration of like what a map can be, in the sense of, like an open world Grand Theft Auto or like a Ubisoft game, where the map is so integrated with the game's content systems that you can use the map as a way of traversing those content systems. So like bringing up quests specifically on the map, seeing where the NPCs are on the map, and then telling the player, sometimes with a literal GPS, like you can turn left here to go over down that street and then end up at that NPC to pick up this quest, which has 3 plot points remaining and you're on the, 7th one. and the 8th one is down that street and off to the left as well. I really loved doing this exercise because it broke a part of my brain that I think had been making assumptions for a long time. I think as players, we typically assume that we know the difference between fun and boring, content and filler. And when something is poorly paced, we usually assume that it's for a kind of reason that I don't think is actually accurate. Because I think ultimately games are just a series of chores that you have to do. And the sense of fun really just comes from your sense of anticipation. And I think that all stories are kind of like that, including games. Anything that requires your attention based on its ability to make you feel that sense of like search and discovery. So after all that, I kind of decided that I did want a map that was semi-Euclidean, or at least as Euclidean as it could be. I wanted players to be able to anticipate where they were going. It's not just a platformer map that I'm building. So what we have is basically a player-facing version of that scene graph thing that I created. So this is the map. I'm showing you all the levels as they have been placed by me in the editor. I'm just placing them exactly where they are when I'm working with them for my own understanding of clicking around in the Unity project. I have the ability to zoom in and out. And right now I have these screenshots that just are the same screenshots that I use to just represent the levels. Maybe later I'll stylize these, but it's really interesting to me when I was thinking about whether I should abstract this. It's interesting how much the color actually affects your sense of the game. So seeing the landmarks, the actual artwork, right? This watchtower is like it's so meaningful because it's such a key landmark as like the halfway point of the chapter. And if I just did a geometry scan and didn't show off the graphics, this level would just be a slope of like an anthill. We've used that analogy a lot on stream, that it just looks like an anthill if you don't have the graphics there. So there's still a bit of work that I'll be doing here to kind of assess what the presentation should look like. But for now, I'm quite happy with these screenshots. I also want to draw your attention to what I've done in the background. So for a while, I had this as just like a semi-transparent shot of what was happening behind the level. But I wanted to instead have this idea of like a void, like a nebula that you were moving through. I thought that was an interesting design choice that I could make to sort of justify the way that the levels have gaps between them. Like when you walk from here to here, there's no actual travel time. It's just you leave here and you enter here. I also want to draw a really clear distinction between a choice that I made. So here, this looks a little bit like spaghetti, right? It's very node based and the connections kind of just go where they go. And that's because obviously they're not aligned, right? Like this well goes down to this, but this would need to be placed right there in order for that to make sense. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be more just about the player's understanding of the levels compared to each other. And so what I did was I drew the lines just between the levels and I made the points just connect as close to the center as they can. The most right-left and the most left-right point, halfway between those two is where this gets drawn. And I'm actually really happy with how this turned out. This was like, it looks pretty good. It does have some sacrifice, right? Like design-wise, you don't know how to get to this door, but you might be able to assume that it's down here somewhere. And also this goes up, but like there's no like elevator in this level. So you kind of have to assume that going right takes you there. Ultimately, this is going to be a bit of a negotiation between me as the designer and the player in terms of how reliable the map is at letting you know how to get from A to B. Like another example is like here, this node goes straight to this one, which passes through this. So me being able to show you that and you being able to interpret that is another challenge I have to get around. But by and large, I'm actually very happy with how this map works. I really love being able to zoom in and out. Like, you know, I'm a UX designer at heart. And so like polish in UI and UX is really something that I'm passionate about. But there's one more thing, which is this idea of being able to use the map to guide the player directly. I have this feature where I'm adding in essentially when you get a new quest that's a main quest, the map can lerp to a specific node and then plant an icon at that node. And then you'll be able to essentially open up the map and check for that main quest icon whenever you like. So because it's an adventure game and the quest progress is kind of more important than the map progress at certain points in the game once you've explored a lot. Being able to rely on the map as a way to give you some kind of direction on where to go for the quest, I think is really, really important. Let me show you a version of the map that's not fully completed, because there's one other choice that I really like that really shaped a lot of how I feel about the game. What I really like is the idea that I can show you the next levels beyond the ones where you are right now, what you've explored. And I feel like this creates this really, really nice breadcrumb feeling of like, I don't know how I'm going to get to the end, but I know that from here there are two places. As I'm checking the map, it's clear to me that I haven't been here yet. And that becomes a little mental side quest, just like in Animal Well, that it's like, oh, I'll have to go back there later and confirm what's in that room. And I feel like this essentially solves that problem that players were having. I've yet to playtest this. I've still been working on a couple of changes, but in terms of the map itself and kind of at least the bare bones features of how it works, I'm very happy. I'm really excited. Even when I'm looking at it myself, I'm excited about what's in this space and what comes up next. And when I go into the map, like, oh, wow, there's like 5 new places that have opened up. How do I get down here? Right? These are like questions that create positive tension, but that don't create strain because you don't have to remember that they were there. You can see them there. So to round out this little case study, I wanted to return to the beginning of this concept of scope creep and really just examine kind of what this all felt like for me. For me, I feel like more than justified by this process. I think that there's no way I could have sat down before doing all of this, the tool design, the play testing, the iteration, exploring other games and doing like a bit of comparative analysis there, and then building it and then tweaking it and play testing it myself. There's no way I could have arrived at what I have now, which I think solves so many problems, if I had started at the beginning and said, I'm just going to make this, right? Because it's what I have right now, or it makes sense to me. In general, I think game design and direction is one of those tasks that you can either approach it very low risk, which makes it easy to budget for. So if you just clone a game that's successful and you use all of their features because they used all of those features, I think that's a fair way to do it, but that will not give you the ability to navigate the design space the way that I've demonstrated today. I don't think I would be able to validate or imagine these features or sign off on them without the process of prototyping and iteration and comparative analysis and all of these things, which I kind of learned more from user-centered design as a designer coming from university and going through a design degree. Making games is extremely hard, and it's extremely difficult to get to the point where you have the competence and the opportunity to learn the things that I've been learning on my game. I've had 8 years to play with these ideas and to do things over multiple iterations, and I've been lucky that I've never had to give away equity in my game or compromise on features in order to find this point. I'm well aware that like most games, even big games, especially big games, don't have that kind of flexibility. But I would challenge you, if you're an indie or just somebody who's passionate about making games, I don't think it's possible to engage in the art form of design and expressing yourself through games as an art form. I don't think it's possible to do that if you are mitigating risk to the point where you aren't exploring the space. You always have to be careful and conscious of timelines and budgets. You always have to be conscious of scope, but you also can't make something special if all you do is copy what other people do because it worked for them. That's my takeaway. Thank you so much for watching. I will catch you in the next video. I'd love to tell you about game scheduling systems. So event queues, action queues, what I call my scheduling system, which is like a nested data structure for doing modular story beats. And yeah, we'll talk about it next time. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.